Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Mackenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, and welcome to tonight's live stream Q&A with Professor Lesley Hughes. So tonight we'll be talking about climate change and bushfires. Fires have been an important feature of the Australian landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. And human management of fires also has a long history, starting with the fire stick farming approach of Indigenous Australians up to 60,000 years ago. In the last few weeks, the news has been dominated with stories of the New South Wales bushfires causing devastation in the Blue Mountains. And at the Climate Council, we've received hundreds of questions asking about the link between climate change and bushfires. Here to address those questions tonight is climate change expert and ecologist, climate councillor Lesley Hughes. Welcome, Lesley.
Thanks, Amanda.
So now many of you have submitted questions online, and you're welcome to keep asking those questions through this session on the website and via Twitter. That said, we might not get through all of them, so if you're looking for more information, have a look at the website on the bushfire page. So we may as well get started. Lesley, I thought to start off, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I've been an ecologist for 20-something years. And I've been interested in the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems for most of that time. I was a former climate commissioner on the Climate Commission, and now I'm very happy to be reprising that role on the Climate Council.
Fantastic. So we may as well get started. There's been many questions coming in, and Robert asked us what circumstances we're likely to be able to say this is a bushfire that we can directly link to climate change. Graham asked, how can you distinguish climate change events from other events? So Lesley, what do we know about the link between bushfires and climate change?
Okay, well, I think we need to go back to basics and think about how we get bushfires. And we get a bushfire, we have to have three things that happen. Firstly, we need an ignition. We need the fire to start in some way. And fires can start by all sorts of means, by lightning or by people. Secondly, we need something to burn. That's the fuel. And the fuel needs to be dry enough and voluminous enough to actually carry a fire. And the third thing we need is the right weather conditions so that the fire will spread and carry. Now, climate change is actually related and can be related to all three of those factors, but in different ways. So let me start with ignition, because this is probably the weakest link. So we know that lightning causes a lot of fires, particularly in some regions and particularly in northern Australia. And we know that you get more lightning in warmer, moister conditions. So in theory, as the climate warms or as rainfall changes, that could affect lightning, but it's probably a relatively minor impact. In southern Australia, of course, most fires are started by people, either deliberately or accidentally, as we've seen this last week in the Blue Mountains. So the climate change link to what starts the fire is not really an issue. Climate change is, however, more strongly linked to fuel. Fuel, of course, is mostly vegetation, and vegetation builds up as plants grow, and then a fire needs a certain amount of vegetation to be carried. If the fuel is very dry, of course, and in this last winter in the Blue Mountains we've had record low soil moisture levels, the vegetation dries out, the soil dries out, and you have perfect conditions for carrying a fire. But thirdly, the third factor is the really critical one where climate change really comes into play. Fires are carried and get more intense if we have warmer conditions, and of course wind speed and relative humidity are also important. But what we've seen in southern Australia in particular over the last few decades is that heat waves are increasing, temperatures are increasing, we're getting hotter, longer heat waves, and that's creating conditions of increased bushfire risk.
So there's a range of ways in which climate change is linked to bushfires, but I suppose the most straightforward way is that it's getting hotter. And
absolutely.
In hotter conditions, we're likely to see more bushfires.
So Australia, as Amanda said in her introduction, is a very fire-prone place. What climate change is doing is simply making it more fire-prone than ever before.
Okay, well, as a follow-up question from Robert, how do we know with each individual bushfire whether or not it's directly linked to climate change?
Well, in some ways, we need to rephrase the question. My apologies, Robert. what we've seen over the last few decades is that the climate is changing. In fact, the climate is much warmer, it has a lot more energy in the system than it used to, and because warm air holds more water, there's a lot more water in the atmosphere. So the baseline climate is different to what it was 50 years ago, and in that sense, all weather and all extreme events, whether it be floods or fires or droughts, all extreme weather events have an element of climate change within them. So it's not really a question of saying this event or that event is or isn't linked with climate change. Climate change underpins all weather and is changing everything.
So the next question comes from Claire, and she asks about, there's a lot of commentary saying that the fires were lit by people and therefore it's got nothing to do with climate change. Now you've touched on this already, but what would you say to this? How would you respond?
Well, as I said, to get a fire going, somebody needs to provide the spark. Now that could be a 10-year-old with a packet of matches, it could be a lightning strike, or it could be, as we've seen this last week, some unfortunate events on an army artillery range. It doesn't matter how the fire starts, it really what matters is what happens to it then.
So the conditions in which the fire grows, if you like, is more important than the initial ignition?
Well, you need the initial ignition, but if the conditions weren't right, the initial ignition wouldn't turn into a bushfire.
Right, okay. Now we've got a question from Ben, and he asks about backburning, and asks, how does that affect fires such as those in New South Wales? Which has been the bigger influence, backburning or is it climate change?
Well, it's a really important issue, the whole issue of prescribed burning or hazard reduction burning, and it's actually quite a contested issue, and it's contested within the scientific community and it's contested amongst other parts of the community, so it's quite complex. Prescribed burning is usually done during cool weather to reduce the amount of fuel, usually in and around property, to try to reduce the risk of a later fire being uncontrolled and very intense, which is when, of course, we get real impacts. Prescribed burning is done all over the world and all over Australia to try to reduce the impact of later intense bushfires, and it seems to be more successful in some parts than in others. So even within the scientific community there's some disagreement as to how effective prescribed burning is, but one study in particular that was published a couple of years ago by Ross Bradstock at the University of Wollongong and his colleagues is particularly, I think, interesting for our Blue Mountains situation. So what they did is that they looked at all the patches of bushland that had been burnt in a prescribed burn, and they counted up how many of them actually met a wildfire, and it was only about 20%. So about 80% of the time a wildfire actually didn't hit a patch of prescribed burn. Then when a wildfire did hit a patch, they looked to see how successful it was in actually stopping the fire. And it was a very modest rate of success. It was about 10%. And if there wasn't a road there, it was even less than that. The other thing about prescribed burning is that within about 5 years of a burn, usually the fuel has reaccumulated to the extent that is similar to what it was before the burn. So you actually have to do prescribed burning a lot. Now, the other problem, of course, is that if you think about coming back again to the bushfires, I'm sure many of the people in the audience will be familiar with the Blue Mountains, where there's a long string of communities out along that ridgetop, surrounded by literally hundreds of thousands of hectares of flammable vegetation. Actually doing enough prescribed burning to completely remove the risk to those communities is impossible. There has been a lot of prescribed burning done. It's done with as many resources as our emergency services can muster, but we're never going to be able to minimise the risk to zero.
What I found really surprising in that answer is the 10% figure, that it's that the impact of the prescribed burning isn't necessarily as high as we'd imagine when you read the media and things like that. Is that something that you think communities need to be more aware of, or we need to factor in more often?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot more research done. So that was only one study that I was citing, and there have been very few studies like that. So we do need a lot more research, and the the answers to that research will vary from place to place. But what we tend to get often is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction after a disastrous bushfire, with people saying, if only there'd been more prescribed burning, my house would have been saved. And, you know, in some cases that might be true, and it's a very, very understandable reaction. But I come back to what I said before, there is no amount of prescribed burning that we can do which will guarantee safety in a bushfire.
I want to go back to a point that you made early in that answer, which touches upon Mary's question, and she asks, how is the fire season changing in respect to climate change?
Well, if we take this year as just an example, of a sort of rather extreme example, often the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales will be still doing prescribed burns through spring. They need cool and still weather to be safe. What we saw this season is that the prescribed burning had to stop early because the actual bushfire season started. And so then the prescribed burning it changes in flavour completely. It becomes back burning in the face of an approaching fire, which is a lot more risky. So what we're seeing with, and we will see increasingly in the future, is as climate change keeps on going and we get more and more hotter, longer fire seasons, the window of opportunity to do the back burning over the winter period, autumn, spring, is actually reducing. So just as we need more hazard reduction, the opportunity to do it is becoming less.
Okay. We'll move on to a question from Jenny, and she asks, since bushfires are becoming more extreme, should Australian governments alter the fuel reduction burning practices? So given all of this information we now have, what should we be doing about it?
Well, look, there's no easy answer to that, and that's because we still need to know a lot about fire behaviour. I think personally there needs to be a lot more scientific research done, but there also needs to be scientists working with planners, you know, really determining where people should be building their houses, and also working with the emergency services. And the one thing we have seen illustrated this fire season is that our emergency services in the future are going to need to be better resourced, because to do prescribed burning to the degree that most people would like is going to take an enormous amount of resources.
And I suppose particularly, as you mentioned, in places like the Blue Mountains where there's that topography, which is quite challenging.
If you think about the Blue Mountains, there's a tremendously enormous perimeter along which people are building, so that the interface between the urban development and the bush is very extensive. And if you wanted to do prescribed burning everywhere that people are building houses, it would be an enormous task. That's
actually a good segue as well to John's question, and he asks, are the impacts of changes in the built environment in Southeast Australia on fire behaviour over the past century greater or less than the effects of climate change during that period?
We can't really answer that question at all, but we can say that those two important factors are acting together. So, of course, as our population grows and as we develop more and more bushland areas, there is more in harm's way. There's more people and there's more houses, so there's more to lose. And that is happening at the same time as the climate is changing and increasing the bushfire risk. So we can't say it's one or the other, or this is this percentage and that's that percentage. Both of those things are actually happening in the same direction to increase the overall risk.
There's quite a few questions that have been coming in about how fires start, and this one comes live from Roy, and he says, can broken glass in the bush provide a spark? As a bush regenerator, I frequently come across broken and unbroken glass. Is that something you've come across in your research?
I haven't seen any research on that. I mean, I know that like lots of little kids with a magnifying glass, I used to like starting fires, and my son certainly did, with a magnifying glass, focusing a sunbeam on a leaf and seeing the smoke coming up. So I guess in theory it's possible, but I haven't actually seen any data on it.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll now move into talking a little bit more about what's happening now and what changes we're seeing in the Australian environment. So Katie has a question, and she asks, were the fires on Black Saturday and in New South Wales unusual?
Well, let's start with Black Saturday. The fire management agencies issue warnings, as everybody would know, on particular days as to what the level of risk is. And the calculations that lie behind those warnings is a thing called the Forest Fire Danger Index. And this index was actually developed at CSIRO in Australia in the 1960s, and it's now used all over the world. And what it basically does is take a whole lot of conditions on that day and the level of fuel load in a particular area, and it comes up with a number, and the higher that number, the higher the risk. Now, the original index was developed on a scale of 0, being absolutely no chance of a fire, no way, to 100, completely uncontrollable fire. Above 50 is considered pretty severe, pretty extreme. On Black Saturday, the calculated index was between 120 and 190. So it was the biggest danger index that had ever been calculated in Australia. So from that perspective, very unusual, completely unprecedented. Now, I personally don't have the indices that have been calculated for the really bad days in the Blue Mountains, but judging from what most of the firefighters are saying and from the Rural Fire Service, those conditions, at least in October, appear to be also unprecedented.
Okay. There's another question about New South Wales bushfires that comes from Patrick, and he says, what time of year have bushfires historically been at their worst in New South Wales?
Well, we tend to get the worst fires usually in late summer. So Black Saturday was in February. I think the Tasmanian fires earlier this year were in January. What is really unusual at the moment, of course, is that we're getting really, really dangerous and uncontrolled fires in October, so in spring. So that is certainly unusual. We have had bushfires in October and probably September before, but once again, these ones seem to be rather unprecedented in terms of their ferocity.
And Ralph has a question related to this as well, and he asks, have we previously ever seen such serious bushfires in October in Australia?
Not to my knowledge, not at least with the devastating impacts on property, but really until this fire season is over and the scientists have had a chance to collate all the data on the extent of the fire and how hot it got, and then compare that data to what we have previously, really it's only anecdotal information at the moment.
We've got a live question here from Blair, who says, has an increase in fires been predicted? He quotes John Howard from 2006. He said, embrace the climate change forecast warning that Australians need to prepare for more extreme weather events. How long has this discourse about fire and climate change been going on?
Well, at least for several decades. I mean, we've known, if we go right back, we've known about the greenhouse effect, the enhanced greenhouse effect and the impact on the world's climate for nearly 200 years. So that's not a new phenomenon. It's probably back in about the 80s or so when scientifically this issue really started to attract a lot of scientific attention. That's when the IPCC started, for example. But really since that time there's been a tremendous amount of research done with scientists warning that climate change will make fires and other extreme events either more intense and or more frequent in the future.
So we might move on to talking a little bit more about what the impacts of bushfires are. Can you give us a general overview, Lesley, about what the impact of bushfires are for the community and for the natural environment?
Sure. So bushfires have all sorts of impacts. Some of them are pretty obvious, really. People can die and get injured. So there are health impacts. Maybe the less obvious health impacts are the impacts of smoke on people with respiratory diseases like asthma, for example. And we know that hospital admissions for asthma go up on smoke days. And actually worldwide it's been calculated that about 350,000 people a year die from respiratory conditions because of smoke globally. We also know that bushfires have quite extreme psychological effects on people. Clearly people that lose their houses or lose loved ones can be affected for the rest of their lives. And even if you go through a close shave in a fire, obviously that can have long-lasting trauma. And that includes firefighters. So there is some data showing the impacts on firefighters. And often those impacts are only evident months or years later. So there are really serious health impacts from fires. Clearly there are impacts on the built environment. People lose their houses, we lose power lines, we lose, roads become impassable, all sorts of things like that. They're pretty obvious. Some of the impacts that are perhaps less obvious are impacts on water. So if you get a fire in a catchment, a couple of things can happen. So immediately after the fire, you tend to get a lot of runoff on an erosion into the waterways, which can contaminate the waterways. And we saw that in the Cotter River catchments, for example, after the 2003 bushfires in Canberra, and that affected Canberra's water supply. Something that people, and I only really started reading about this the other day, something that people might not appreciate is that after a fire, when the vegetation starts to regrow in a catchment, you actually get a decline in water flow into the rivers, because the growing vegetation actually uses a lot more water than the mature forest that it displaced. So for some years after a big fire in a catchment, there's actually a reduced water supply because the plants are sucking it up. Then, of course, there's lots of impacts on the natural environment, and despite the fact that our plants and animals have mostly evolved in an environment of very intense and frequent fires over hundreds of thousands of years, if fires are very intense and or come in short succession, you can get really big impacts. So if we think about animals, animals that can fly, like birds can usually get out of the way, but animals like koalas and possums that can't fly, there is huge mortality in bushfires. And even if they survive the fire, soon after the fire there may not be very much to eat because the habitat's completely changed. Our plants, Australian plants, are very well adapted. Many species are very well adapted to fires. Many of them need fires to reproduce. So conversely, if we keep fire out of a location for many, many years, you can lose some species because they can't reproduce. But even those species that reproduce by seed after a fire, if the adults are killed by a fire and that you then get another fire happening in quick succession, there's often not enough time for the adult plant to have grown up and become reproductively mature and set more seed. So if you have very, very frequent fires, you can actually change the mix of species, even in quite fire-adapted communities. And fire is actually capable of being what we call a tipping point or a tipping element. That is, certain fire regimes, that is, which is a combination of the intensity and frequency and seasonality of fire, can actually shift one type of vegetation quite rapidly across a tipping point, a threshold, into another type of vegetation. And a lot of climate ecologists actually feel that some of the biggest impacts of climate change on ecosystems will be via the impacts of climate change on fire.
Well, it's a huge array of potential impacts that fire may have. We have another question that hits on one other potential element, which is from Peter, and he asks, what average contribution does fire, like the existing New South Wales fire, make to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? So does fire have an impact on how the climate is changing?
Yes, and it's a very good question, and it's a very complex issue. There was a paper published just recently summarising Australia's carbon budget, and if I remember the figures correctly, the amount that we put into the atmosphere of carbon from fossil fuels is about 96 million tonnes a year. The amount that goes in the average year from fire is about 26. So it's actually a very significant part of the carbon budget in Australia and elsewhere. So when you get a fire through an area, of course, all the carbon that was in the wood and the vegetation becomes combusted and goes into the air, mostly as carbon dioxide. So fires do put a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. Of course, that carbon can then get recycled in the vegetation. But it's actually even more complicated than that, because the other thing that fires do is put a lot of ash into the atmosphere and aerosols, and they can actually have a cooling effect because those little particles can reflect the sun's light, sun's heat. So the other thing that can happen is when you remove vegetation from an area, that affects how much heat is reflected from that surface. It affects the reflectivity of the surface. So some of those impacts go in the same direction and some of them go in opposing directions. So the net effect of fire on the climate is a very, very complicated issue, and it's the subject of a lot of research at the moment for obvious reasons.
So I get this clear, when you have an area of land that is denuded of trees, if you like, it is reflecting more sunlight.
Well, if the surface is black, it's actually absorbing more heat at the surface as well.
So when it's been burnt down, it's absorbing more heat? On
the black surface, yes.
Okay, so that's having a positive feedback, if you like.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And now I've got a question from Sam, and he asks about the head of the United Nations climate negotiations recently pointed to Australia's bushfires as a sign of what the world can expect. Are other countries around the world susceptible to fire? And I know you've been looking at that in your research around our report.
Look, there's lots of countries around the world that have fire regimes a bit like ours. So some of the countries that have what we call a Mediterranean climate, not only around the Mediterranean but in other parts of the world as well, get very frequent fires. Places like California get very frequent fires. And there's a lot of fire in places like Alaska and Canada and the northern US, as well as savannas in Africa, some in South America. So there are lots of fire-prone countries around the world. What we are seeing now is an increasing number of scientific papers being published showing increases in fire activity in some of those locations. Particularly in North America, there's been some very, very strong signals of increasing fire frequency and fire intensity. And some of those signals have been attributed to the climate changing.
We now have another question that's coming live from David, and he asks, what is the expected weed growth response to climate change and its effect on fire risk?
Very complicated question also. All weeds are different species, and all species are going to respond somewhat differently to climate change, so it really will depend on the species. Some will do better, some will do worse. But if I can use just a couple of examples from the Northern Territory, one of the really interesting research questions at the moment, and a lot of people are doing research on this, is what they call the intensification of the fire cycle by introduced grasses. And I'll use just one example, which is gamba grass, which is an introduced African grass species that just loves Northern Australia. It grows to 4 metres in a very short time. It dries off in the dry season and is this perfect fuel for fires. And what it does is that it makes fires more likely to be carried and much, much hotter than the equivalent native vegetation that it replaced. So this is one of the big unknowns with climate change and the interaction with invasive species. In some cases, like gamba grass, the introduction of the invasive species is simply making it worse as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving on to, there's been a whole bunch of questions trying to understand this issue and coming across a whole bunch of myths in the media and things like that. Jeff asks, I often hear the phrase hottest on record. Given that our records are very recent in a geological timescale sense, how do we know that the hottest day is not just a blip on the chart? Okay, so the phrase hottest on record is really sort of a shorthand. We have in Australia, for example, temperature records that are fairly reliable going back to about 1910. So when people say hottest on record, they will probably be referring to hottest since we started measuring them with temperature gauges going back to 1910. So that's usually what it's meant. Yeah, what it means. And of course, the last year there's been many records broken around heat, and indeed, that is, of course, you've been talking about the impact of heat on bushfires. So what do those records that have been broken this year mean for our environment? Yeah, well, over the last summer, for example, and the Climate Commission put out a report called The Angry Summer to capture this, we had over 120 records broken, many of which were temperature records. So we had the hottest summer, the hottest January, the hottest day, the hottest 3 days. It was a really uncomfortable time. But since then, and this is very important for the current situation in the Blue Mountains and the Central Coast of New South Wales, we had the hottest September on record. I believe we had the third hottest July on record, and actually the hottest 12-month period if we take it from last October to this September. So together with very low rainfall over this last winter, which meant that the soil moisture and the fuel moisture was very low, we really did have perfect conditions for a pretty intense fire season starting early. I've got a question live here from Vicky, and she says, I've heard people say that fires are more due to poor management of forestry and national parks, or even to too much conservation. Is that true?
Well, it comes back to this question of prescribed burning and also the question of where people want to live. If nobody lived near bushland, then the problem for human lives and property simply wouldn't exist. But lots of people do like to live near national parks and do like to live near bushland because they're nice places to live. So that's the trade-off. But it also comes back to this as I said before, a very contested issue of prescribed burning and how much we should do. Obviously, nobody wants to live on a scorched earth. People, if you want to live in bushland, you want to be able to see trees. Yeah. So, as I said earlier, we're never going to be able to do enough prescribed burning to reduce, to take the risk away completely. It's really going to be always a balance.
Well, moving on to talking about what the future looks like for Australia, and with the climate changing, what the bushfire risk may look like. Jaden asks, is there a possibility that Australia could become essentially uninhabitable within the next century due to climate change?
Well, I guess to answer that question, it's a question of how you want to live, really. And if I could illustrate this with, I did some travelling recently and spent a few days in Dubai in the Middle East. And when we landed in Dubai at 5:30 in the morning, it was 42 degrees. And that it wasn't even the hottest time of the year. In the hottest times, it gets well over 50 degrees. Now, under those sorts of conditions, I certainly felt that I couldn't go outside. It was simply too hot and too uncomfortable. And so everybody spends their time inside in air conditioning because that's the only way you can be comfortable. Now, personally, I wouldn't want to live like that. I like being outside. So that is not an environment I would choose to inhabit. Now, clearly lots of people live in Dubai and probably like it. So it's a question of really where you like to live. I think there will be parts of Australia that become more and more uninhabitable if you don't like really, really hot weather. There'll be, of course, other parts of the country that will be subject to sea level rise and you won't be able to build a house really close to the coast as we do now. But ultimately it's going to be people's choice. However, lots of people around the world, of course, don't have the luxury of choice that most of us here in Australia do, and many of the most vulnerable people in developing countries are living in places where the risk of future climate change is extremely high and really don't have anywhere else to go. And if we think about some of the low-lying Pacific islands, all the people living on the mega deltas in Bangladesh, for example, you know, there are hundreds of millions of people living in places that may not physically exist in 100 years' time. So it's really going to depend on who you are, what capacity you have, but unfortunately some of the most vulnerable in the world are going to be at the greatest risk.
And I suppose that's true too of those most vulnerable within our own community and their capacity to adapt as well. Well,
that's right, and we see even in a relatively well-developed country like Australia that the risks of extreme events visit different people in different ways. So those that have chronic diseases, for example, or who are disabled. There's an interesting study done on the deaths in the Ash Wednesday fires from 1983, where they looked at how many of the people that died in those fires actually had disabilities or were over 70 or were under 12. And there was a disproportionate number of deaths amongst those people because they were less able to get out.
Which I suppose also talks to how we prepare.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to a question from Kirsty, and she asks, what are the projected increases in bushfires over the coming decades, and how are these fires changing characteristics? Will they be hotter, fiercer, or more widespread? Will wet winters contribute to the problem by increasing fuel loads? Can you describe what the future would look like?
Well, yes, it's complicated because fire is inherently complicated. So as the climate changes and most places will get warmer, that will inherently increase bushfire risk in places like Australia. The fuel situation makes things a bit more complicated though. So in places where the vegetation is limited in its growth by water availability, If those places get drier, so we have less fuel, we may have the situation that some places the bushfire risk will decrease because there's simply less fuel, even though it's still getting hotter. However, most of the modelling that's been done, and it's been done in all sorts of ways using all sorts of climate change scenarios, the bottom line is that virtually all the modelling studies show that at least by the second half of this century, if not sooner, the overall bushfire risk in Australia will be far greater.
Mm-hmm. We've now got one more question that I think we have time for on this question of the future. I'll just move down to it. I'll move on actually to communications. I've lost that question. Emily asks, where should we get the information from? So there's been a whole lot of questions that have been about how should we be talking about this issue, where should we get our information from? Obviously there's been a big discussion in the media about it. And so how would you answer Emily's question about where we should go for information on this?
Well, the Climate Council, of course. Look, if I can step back and talk a bit about our precursor organisation, which was the Climate Commission, that was set up really, and we worked very hard on that commission to be a trusted voice of information, a trusted conduit of information, I should say. You know, if you type the words climate change into Google, you know, that is a surefire way of going mad. I don't know how many billion hits that you would get, but it would be considerable. There's a lot of good information out there and there's a lot of really terrible information out there. And it's not surprising that a lot of people without a climate science degree can get a bit confused. So we were set up to really be one source of credible, hopefully accessible information. What we do in our reports is that we go back to the primary literature, the scientific literature that's been peer reviewed. And if I could just say something about the peer review process, because we use that term a lot, and not unless you're a practicing scientist, you probably don't understand what it is. If I decide to do an experiment and I go and collect some data and I write a paper and I would submit that to a journal to be published, because unless you publish, there's not much point doing it. When I send a paper off to a journal, what would happen normally is that the editor of that journal have a quick look at the paper, and then they would send it out to review. And it's usually sent out to 3 or so anonymous reviewers that are experts in that particular field. They read the paper, they make suggestions, and they decide whether it's good enough to be published in that journal. This process can actually take quite some time, and I think all of us have had the experience of having papers rejected by journals as not being good enough. That's quite common. So any piece of data that gets eventually into a decent scientific or other journal has actually been through quite a thorough review process by other experts in the field.
Quality control, if you like.
Exactly, quality control. So when we're putting together our reports on lots and lots of information like that, we go back to those original papers. We read how the experiments or the modelling studies were done, we look at the data, we look at the conclusions that the scientists drew, and we try to extract from that the sorts of information that we think people should be informed about, and then try to collate that and present it in a way that it's readable for the general public. But on top of what we do, of course, there's fantastic organisations like the Bureau of Meteorology, like CSIRO, like the Australian Academy of Sciences, all put out fantastic information about climate change.
And we've also, you're on our website at the moment, and obviously don't click out of this, but afterwards there's a bushfire page which has a link to a previous extreme weather report by the Climate Commission, which has a whole section starting from page 37 on bushfires if you'd like more information. Now we'll move on to a question from Marco, and he asks, what do scientists look at to understand fire and to understand the increased risks of climate change?
Well, there's a lot of different things that different scientists do. We can do experiments where we can actually light fires and under certain conditions and measure what happens, measure what the impacts are or how hot things get with different amounts of fuel, those sorts of things. We can look at observational data, so look back at previous fires and compare for example, the spread of the fire or the intensity of the fire with the conditions on the day to correlate those things, to understand better what might happen in the future. And we can use models of climate to look ahead. Obviously, the future hasn't happened yet. Anytime we look at the future, whether it's the weather forecast for tomorrow or the climate change predictions for 50 years hence, all of those things require models. But we can test those models. They're based on our physical understanding of the climate and the environment. We can test them by looking back at the observations to see if those models were good predictors of that information, and the better they are at explaining past observations, the more confidence that we can have in them for explaining future observations. So really, scientists don't use one single method. We use an integration of those methods to understand things like fire, which is an inherently very, very complicated process.
With all of the different factors that are influencing
Exactly.
it. Now move on to a question from Mike, and he asks, why has the science of climate change been so politicised in Australia, especially when government-funded scientists in the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO have been studying and monitoring the effects of climate change for many years? So obviously this has been coming up as an issue in the media in the last couple of weeks as well. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I'll respond by saying that it's an enormous shame. What we should have is good policy based on facts, on our best understanding of the facts as we have them. As I said earlier, we've known about the enhanced greenhouse effect for nearly 200 years, 190 years. We understand the physics. The models are being improved all the time. We now have long runs of observational data that are consistent with the models and consistent with our physical understanding of the climate system. The facts are all there, and all we can hope is that our policymakers actually put into place policies and practices that are actually based on the facts.
And I always like that stat that from John Cook's research, it says that 97, I think it's actually 98% of scientists now are on the same page on this issue. They are concerned about climate change, they understand that it's happening. It's a real rarity that you get that sort of consensus in the science.
Exactly. I mean, most science is predicated on arguing about things because that's how scientists like to operate. But there's really very little argument about this. And it is a continual frustration to scientists, especially in this space, as no doubt it is to much of the public, as to how politicised this issue is in Australia. It's not politicised everywhere in the world. It really isn't. And I hope that we can move ahead with a more mature discourse based on the facts in the future.
We have a question now from Glenda, and she asks, how do you counter simplistic climate denial comments such as climate change doesn't cause bushfires, people do, and Australia has always suffered bushfires, don't be alarmist. I've tried to counter such comments by saying that climate change creates the conditions in which more frequent and severe bushfires occur, and that the trends will worsen. However, this logic has no impact on others that she's speaking to. So what advice can you give Glenda as to how to have a productive conversation about this at the barbecue?
Well, Glenda, I share your frustration. Of course, I've often been in the same situation. Look, I'll say a couple of things. Look, there is a small section of the Australian community that it won't matter how many facts are presented to them or how well they're communicated or what the degree of logic is in those facts. They are in denial and will remain in denial. And to be honest, my attitude is I've got better things to do with my time than trying to argue the inarguable with those sort of people. So save yourself the frustration. As far as the whole question of natural variability is concerned, of course we live in the climate varies, the environment varies. Coming back to what we said at the beginning of this Q&A, the essential facts about this situation are these. Australia is a highly flammable continent. We have had lots of fire for hundreds of thousands of years. We are very, very fire prone. Climate change is simply making us more fire prone.
We now have a question from a volunteer firefighter, and he's interested in what other firefighters are thinking. And he's asked, have volunteer firefighters been studied? And he's wondering if there's a survey around their opinions. I have a quote, actually. I had a look at this afternoon. And the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility report actually asked a range of firefighters this question. And a senior Victorian fire officer interviewed in 2012 said, "You don't find many climate change skeptics on the end of a fire hose anymore. They're dealing with increasing number of fires, increasing rainfall events and increasing storm events." What's been your experience of meeting firefighters with the Climate Commission and in your work?
Well, I've met a few, I suppose, in our Climate Commission visits. These guys and girls are on the front line. You know, this is life and death stuff for them. It's not an academic exercise by any means. You know, as we've seen, you know, the heroic efforts over the last couple of weeks in the Blue Mountains. People have done some incredible things, incredibly brave things, incredibly risky things. These are the people on the front line that we need to look after. They need to be prepared, they need to be better resourced, and really what climate change means in terms of climate change adaptation is that resourcing things like firefighting efforts in the future is going to be even more important than it is now. So we need to adapt, we need to prepare, and we need to bite the bullet about the resources for these sort of people and these sort of activities.
And I suppose this is why at the Climate Council we thought it was really important to be communicating about this issue at this time, because essentially this is when people have the questions, whether it's emergency services workers, whether it's communities that are affected, the general public or health services. It's in people's minds. What is the connection? And it's our job to be out there saying, well, this is what we know and this is the best science that's available.
Yeah. I can understand that when people are absolutely on the front line trying to battle to save lives and property, having an argument about the science is not the thing most uppermost in their minds. But these sorts of events do raise the issue. We've seen an extraordinary amount of media in the past couple of weeks about climate change in general, as well as the link to bushfires. We need to keep talking about climate change. Climate change is going to be with us for all of our lifetimes and most of our kids' and grandkids' lifetimes, unless we manage to cut emissions so deeply that we stabilise the climate by the middle of this century. So these questions and these events are not going to go away. They're going to intensify in the future, and we need to do something about it.
There's been a range of questions coming in about how we can prepare as a community for these events, and Mark wrote in and said, in the face of increased occurrence and intensity of bushfires, what steps can be taken to fireproof communities in bushfire-prone areas?
Well, I don't think there's any such thing as fireproofing. I mean, you can have a house burn down in the middle of the suburbs, of course. I think there's going to have to be really serious discussions with planners and local governments, with scientists doing research, and with our emergency services to come up with coordinated responses. And those responses are going to be different in different parts of the country. The sorts of firefighting and planning that you might do in the Blue Mountains might be very different to what you would do around Perth or in the Adelaide Hills, for example. But it's not going to go away. We may have a reduced risk of fire next season, who knows. But if we look long term, the risks of these extreme events are going to intensify, and we really need to be prepared. Okay, well that's about all that we've got time for tonight. So in summary, I suppose Australia is a very fire-prone country and climate change is making it more fire-prone, as Lesley's said a couple of times. Lesley, do you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to make before we sign off? Well, Will Stephan, who's another climate councillor with me, and I are working at the moment on a report for the council on bushfires and climate change. We actually decided to do this report back in September when we first launched the council. We knew we'd had a really dry and warm winter. It was pretty clear it was going to be a massive bushfire season. We just didn't quite know that it was going to start quite so early. And we decided that it would be timely to make the bushfire report, our first report of the council. So we're hoping to release that in a few weeks. It's been a mammoth task. The literature, the scientific literature on fires and climate change is enormous, and we're going through that as thoroughly and carefully as we can to try to distill it all down into a document that is readable, and hopefully will keep answering a lot of the questions that we didn't have time for today.
Yep. And if you're a founding friend, you'll get an email about that report when it comes out, so you can sign up at our website. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope it was useful for you and answered or addressed some of your questions. Thank you, Lesley, for sharing all of your incredible knowledge with us. And thank you to all the founding friends who have made events like this possible. And if you'd like to become a founding friend and support our work, you can find more information on the homepage. So thank you, and good night from us.
Thank you.